Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, May 18th, 1992, just as the George H.W. Bush re-election campaign is starting to heat up, Vice President Dan Quayle tossed a family values grenade into the middle of the room. Quayle was giving a speech. The speech was actually on May 19th, for what it's worth. He's giving a speech on May 19th in San Francisco, and he spent a large part of that speech talking about the LA riots that had raged a few weeks earlier in the aftermath of the Rodney King verdict. His diagnosis of the root cause of the riots was a, quote, poverty mindset in the black community. He talked about family values in the black community, but then towards the end of the speech, he made an interesting connection, talking about the overall erosion of family values as he saw it in the United States. He said, quote, "It doesn't help matters when primetime TV has Murphy Brown, a character who supposedly epitomizes today's intelligent, highly paid professional woman, mocking the importance of fathers by bearing a child alone and calling it just another lifestyle choice." He was referring to the very popular TV show Murphy Brown played by Candice Bergen, that just the night before had aired in an episode that 38 million people watched. In that episode, Brown indeed became a single mother. This caused an enormous firestorm, so here to discuss Dan Quayle versus Murphy Brown and lots more are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
This is one we are very excited to talk about. There's so much here, tons that we've kind of forgotten in the time or just discovering new, including, Kellie, this notion that this was in a speech about Rodney King. You'd think Rodney King, there's enough sort of provocative material there, but no, it's this throwaway line at the end that makes all the news.
Yeah. Matter of fact, almost everything that he said before that got completely ignored, neglected. To some degree, I'm okay with that because the ideas that he was pushing about the black community were not good. He starts out strong asking these questions of sort of like, why are we here? How did this happen? And then it just sort of spirals out of that. And then really gets eclipsed by this, single mom, disposal of dads debacle that takes all the air or takes all the attention away from the Rodney King riots and trial and the way that people were feeling in the country in terms of racial tensions.
And, it is, on the one hand, comes off as this weird little, like, tidbit, like, oh, this thing happened on TV last night, I'm going to throw in this news hooky sort of take. But it is also, at least in the Quayle's mind, and in I think a lot of the thinking of the time, this question of the erosion of family values, the erosion of traditional, quote-unquote, traditional families and communities really was at the center of a lot of the discourse. So maybe let's paint that picture a bit and then talk about what happens with the Murphy Brown situation.
Yeah, I think it's really important to underscore that this was happening during the primary season when Pat Buchanan was putting up a challenge against George H.W. Bush. And so that focus on incendiary culture wars issues, which was very much a hallmark of Pat Buchanan's campaign, the Bush campaign was trying to figure out how to deal with that, how to both protect themselves from appearing as extreme as Pat Buchanan, but also he was fairly successful in some of those early primaries, and so how to co-opt some of that. And so Dan Quayle, who was the more conservative person on the ticket, becomes the red meat guy who is going to go after characters like Murphy Brown. And so it feeds into this sense that both the politics of the family are at the heart of politics in 1992, but also this idea of culture wars, right? He's talking about a television show, and he gets the response from journalists is, yeah, that's what we want to talk about. We want to talk about his attack on that television show.
Yeah. And it doesn't hurt that, or it doesn't help, I should say, that this is the series finale in which Murphy Brown gives birth to a child and sings to him that she's a natural woman, and the ratings are high. Everyone has watched this show. And it's also, a high-powered, public-facing career woman who's sort of like a reincarnation of Mary Tyler Moore in a lot of ways, but a little bit more, saltier, but I think that there's so much attention around this particular episode, being that it was the finale, and that people are talking about it, and now they're talking about it in tandem with this speech.
Yeah, and I think, well, first again, a reminder of just in that era, in 1992, the power of a primetime TV show, 38 million people watch it. I mean, last episode we talked about, that radio debate that 40 million people listen to. I mean, you just don't get those numbers anymore. Yeah. So that is, I think, important context, and points out that, yes, Murphy Brown, which, by the way, was a show that had kind of been like pushing the edge on some of these issues, culture war issues, for a while. And I think it even maybe had a spat with Dan Quayle or two, a joke or two about Dan
Everyone
Quayle.
had a joke or two about Dan Quayle in the early 90s.
Exactly. They were so a very big show, culturally important show that is pushing the agenda. That said, I do think it is important to also think of Murphy Brown as a bit of an outlier, and what Dan Quayle did as a bit of cherry picking here. Because if you look at, and this is, I think really important context, if you look at the rest of the context of what is happening on TV at that time, it is very quote unquote family values centric. You have shows like Roseanne and Home Improvement that are about, the suburban married couple with 2.5 kids and the white picket fence and all that stuff. And so, again, such a hallmark of the culture war fodder, but it's like very selective, right? And so Dan Quayle is not picking a fight with, he's taking a couple examples and trying to wage a much bigger narrative war.
Yeah, I think that's really useful for underscoring just how conservative in a cultural way television was, especially primetime television, that showing people who were divorced, or showing a career woman who wasn't gonna get married. She was gonna decide to have a family of her own on her own is such a break from not just the formula, but from the values that were espoused by network television.
Cosby Show too, I think, had just ended that spring, but obviously a massive force in terms of that. Sorry, Kellie, go on.
No, it's just crazy to think about how controversial it would be to be a single mother in your 40s, when that is really like the new average age, late 30s, in which women are having children and having their careers, and the idea of being a single mom there is not really stigmatized in the same way. You see it all throughout TV. In many cases, you see people having children first and then getting married later, if they choose to get married. So the cultural context that we live in now is so drastically different and much more accepting than what was in this moment that, I don't know, I kind of think it's like the height of focus on the family too. Like if you think of the conservative evangelical movement, they're pushing all of these religious traditional values on the family. And so this is really in direct response to that.
Television is definitely a lag indicator of changes in the culture and in the structure of family life. I would also say this is a moment when career women are at the heart of a lot of those anxieties, right? You were talking about focus on the family and traditional values. There are all of these. There's a blow up, a dust up that happens in the 1992 race where Hillary Clinton makes a comment about being a career woman instead of a stay-at-home mom, and it creates this nightmare for the campaign where she ends up having to bake cookies in order to show that she's a traditional woman.
Hillary Clinton bakes cookies, put it on the list. Yep. Definitely an episode. Okay,
that definitely needs to be an episode. Definitely.
So this dust up, or whatever you want to call it, well, first to paint a picture, it goes on for a long time. So, this is not a one news cycle thing. And I think very quickly, as you were saying, Niki, the media realizes, we got something here. But in the immediate aftermath, the Daily News headline, Quayle to Murphy Brown, you tramp, is the headline of the Daily News. Diane English, the show's creator, responds by saying, quote, if the vice president thinks it's disgraceful for an unmarried woman to bear a child, and if he believes that a woman cannot adequately raise a child without a father, then he'd better make sure abortion remains safe and legal. It's a pretty solid response.
Shots fired.
Yeah. But the White House starts getting questions about it. Quayle... And then this, to me, is the most interesting wrinkle here, because Quayle sort of tries to continue this fight and really has a hard time following through. So he kind of fumbles a little bit when he gets questions. And then a few days later, he's still getting questions. And he just sort of, in an exasperated way, tells reporters, look, I don't know that much about the show. I've told you I don't want any more questions about it. Which, to me, of all the things that this sort of echoes the nature of culture debates and whatever you want to call it, the PC wars, the culture wars, the cancel culture stuff. This, to me, is the one that I think is so fascinating, which is just like this desire to score your points and then move on and not take any follow-up questions. I just want to send my tweet. I want to send my meme, and then and you see it, and that is the most infuriating part of all of it, is this desire to lob a grenade and then walk away. I mean, that just echoes so much to what we see now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it would have been better if he had even doubled down and said, the importance of my speech was Rodney King and the riots. And it's so interesting how when you think back on this, it's called the Murphy Brown speech. It has nothing to do with Black poverty, the state of Black families, or the state of the violent tension in LA. So all of that got completely erased.
Yeah. And we should say that this continued on into the fall, because when Murphy Brown comes back for her season opener in the fall of 1992, first of all, the presidential campaign is in full flower at that moment. And everyone wants to see how the show is going to respond to this. Those 38 million people, that sort of eye-popping number that you talked about earlier, 70 million people tuned in. 70 million people. That's more people than watch the Super Bowl. It's wild to think about. It's not to say that the U.S. had a monoculture in the early 1990s, but when do 70 million people watch anything? It's such an amazing number.
Yeah. I also think it's interesting because, we think about award shows and the Emmys, and Candace Bergen gets to be so petty, and I love it. When she wins her Emmy, she comes on stage and says, I like to thank the vice president. and the whole audience sort of erupts with laughter, and then she closes by thanking the writers for not only writing great words but also spelling them correctly. Also another dig. So this keeps playing out, and it's Quayle cannot walk away from it.
Yeah, that's another sort of parallel and interesting thing to think about, is that often in these spats, everyone actually kind of ends up winning, right? Attention is attention. And so, Candace Bergen comes out of this just fine, too. It is interesting to look at, even in the subsequent years, 5 years later, 10 years later, a generation later, this keeps coming up. Quayle keeps getting interviewed about it. And he does eventually sort of find that footing, Kellie, that I feel like you identified that he didn't find at the time. And maybe it's just massaging retroactively, but he has, in subsequent years, he said that what he was really trying to point out was the erasure of the father, not the single motherhood that was giving him pause, but the idea that it was erasing the father, which if you want to make that point, there's better ways to make that point than going after a TV show that happens to be about a single mother. But that, I think, eventually becomes the sort of ground on which he wants to have the argument. And interestingly enough, Candace Bergen kind of says That's not that far from what our show was trying to talk about. Our show was trying to talk about how hard it is to be a single woman, how families, do have a role. And we sort of engaged with the fact that there wasn't a father a lot on our show. Obviously, at the time, no one was being that nuanced.
Yeah, she basically says, I agree with you. She adds that nobody agreed more than that fathers are not dispensable. And so I think in a plot twist, the fact that they were similarly on somewhat common ground is something that I think is interesting.
Yeah, it recast the entire episode. Was it all just to juice ratings? What was behind the dust up? I actually think that it touched on genuine cultural tensions like we've been talking about. And I think that it was a real and an important political argument that was happening, but that sort of hazy bipartisan coming together that happens 10 years later is a fascinating twist on the story.
Yeah. All right. Well, we should start to wrap up. Any other tidbits? Murphy Brown did try and reboot the show in 2017.
Yeah, that didn't go so well. She tried to reboot the show and almost sort of again, do a reinvention of this moment in which she's confronting President Trump and talking about Steve Bannon and mocking political figures and writing about the Me Too movement and all these hot button issues. And people were just like, no. And the show is quickly canceled. So it doesn't have the same sort of appeal that it did in the 80s, or in the 90s, I should say.
Yeah. Well, that's, says so much probably about just the nature of people don't get their jabs in on primetime TV anymore, right?
Yeah.
There's other ways to do that. And so it probably says a lot. But
must-see TV is over. I mean, 70 million
That's
people
true.
did not tune in for the reboot in 2017. And I don't think that it was just that there was not a national appetite for Murphy Brown. It's just such a different cultural and political and media landscape that there was no recapturing that magic.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
These are difficult times for our country, and in searching for the causes of our social ills, we could choose to blame the media, or the Congress, or an administration that's been in power for 12 years, or we could blame me.
Radiotopia.